The American Quilt Study Group presents Quilts in a Material World. What is material culture? Part 2 with Susan Jerome. Susan J. Jerome is the collections manager at the University of Rhode Island Historic Textile and Costume Collection and the Curator Registrar for the University of Connecticut M. Estelle Sprague Costume Collection. She earned her MS degree from the University of Rhode Island, focusing on textile and clothing history. Ms. Jerome sits on the National Board of the American Quilt Study Group and the Costume Society of America Northeastern Region Advisory Committee. She writes and lectures on topics of clothing and needlework history.
Today we're going to take a second look at a quilt that I have in my possession. We're going to start, though, with a few quotes that I think are important. I am going to read them just for those who may not be able to do so easily. The first one is from the Lowell Offering, which was a publication put together by young women who worked in Lowell, Massachusetts at the printing and textile mills in the 1840s. This is called the Patchwork Quilt, and it was written by somebody called Annette, but in actuality is Harriet Farley, who was one of the editors of the publication. And she writes, "Yes, there is the patchwork quilt, looking to the uninterested observer like a miscellaneous collection of odd bits and ends of calico. But to me, it is a precious reliquary of past treasures, a storehouse of valuables, almost destitute of intrinsic worth. Gentle friends, it contains a piece of each of my childhood's calico gowns and of my mother's and sisters, and that is not all. I must tell you, and then you will not wonder, that I have chosen for this entertainment my patchwork quilt." And Harriet goes on to write this wonderful story about patchwork quilts, which you can find through the Hathi Trust. Go online, you can find the whole article. The second quote is from Lucy Larcom. "Another trial confronted me in the shape of an ideal but impossible patchwork quilt. We learned to sew patchwork at school while we were learning the alphabet, and almost every girl, large or small, had a bed quilt of her own begun, with an eye to future house furnishing. I was not over fond of sewing, but I thought it best to begin mine early. I could dream over my patchwork, but I could not bring it into conventional shape. My sisters, whose fingers had been educated, called my sewing goblins. I grew disgusted with it myself and gave away all my pieces except the pretty sea moss pattern, which I was not willing to see patched up with common calico. It was evident that I should never conquer fate with my needle." Now, Lucy Larcom was a well-known author of her day. She wrote her A New England Girlhood, from which this quotation is taken, as sort of an autobiography later on in life. She grew up in Massachusetts, and when her mother was widowed in the 1840s, her mother became a supervisor for one of the boarding houses that was run by the mills themselves for the young women who worked in their mill houses. And Lucy herself began working in the boot mill in Lowell at the age of 11. The boot mill is now part of a national park, so you can visit it as well. She never married, and she certainly couldn't or didn't wish to conform to some of society's expectations of the day. I bring up both Harriet and Lucy because their words have influenced how we feel about quilts even today. Quilts come with many stories. Some are more accurate than others. And we're going to hear a few in this presentation. And I want you to think about this. What makes a quilt valuable? Is it because it's really old? Is it in very good condition? Maybe the design is interesting or unique. Perhaps the technical skill of the maker you feel may make a quilt valuable. Perhaps George Washington slept under it. The quilt that we're going to look at is this log cabin quilt. We're going to use some of the basic techniques of looking at a material culture study to analyze this particular log cabin quilt now in my keeping. A material culture study asks these questions: who, where, what, why, when, and how. So we're going to look at those things in analyzing this log cabin quilt. A material culture study involves looking at the artifact, the quilt. We're going to look at the history, material, construction, design, and function. And we're going to use identification, evaluation, cultural analysis, and interpretation, what you see along the right-hand side, in conjunction with history, material, construction, design, and function to sort of analyze our quilt. This is the more academic approach to material culture study. You can also use this wonderful 8-page form that's available through the Quilt Index online. This asks you so many of the questions needed to analyze a quilt and to come to some conclusions and to understand some of the stories that a quilt may have. You can download this readily. It comes in PDF and Word online. If you need to have something that really organizes your analysis of a quilt, please use the Quilt Index form. It's really a wonderful device. So let's get started with the basics for our log cabin quilt. Provenance, the history of the piece. This quilt came to me from an acquaintance. He brought it into the shop in which I was working. I'm going to call him Peter, about 7 years ago. Peter's wife had recently passed away, and he didn't know what to do with the quilt. It was from her family. He thinks that she came from upstate New York, maybe around Albany area. Didn't know anything more about the quilt. So the provenance for this piece is fairly weak. Now, I could certainly do more research, more genealogical research on Peter's wife, I'll call her Barbara, on her family, where she came from. I have not done that. That is one avenue that still can be done to find out more about this quilt. It's important to know that both Peter and Barbara worked in museums. So they were both quite, I think, appreciative of old things. You know, they're not just willing to throw something away because it's old and it's worn out and it's tired. And they understand, I think each of them understands that an artifact has a place in today's world. Also, as Peter laid the quilt upon the table and we were beginning to unfold it, I had to understand that the quilt was part of Peter's working through the reflection of the grief that he had for his wife's passing. It's important for me to remember that. It's important for us to remember that that's part of the history of the piece and part of where the piece sits today in my sewing room. When was the quilt made? Well, we're going to look at what the fabrics and such say about that. Who used the quilt? As I told you, it really comes from a friend's family. So I'm going to assume that it was part of her family's household furnishings, and I can do more research on that. Why was the quilt made? And I think that's always an interesting question. Utilitarian, creative, perhaps both. Certainly the condition of the quilt says that it was well used. This is not a piece that was to be saved. It was a quilt to be put on somebody's bed. Log cabin quilt with the barn raising placement of the lights and the darks. Measures about 84 by 84, and like so many older things, it's not quite square. So the blocks, as you can see, about 14 inches. The strips are about 1.5 inches wide. The center block for each is about 3 inches. And it is made from a wide variety of printed fabrics, probably all of them cottons. From a distance, it doesn't look too bad, but it is definitely in poor condition. It has areas, quite a number of areas where the textile has just disintegrated. There are numerous tears, overall soiling. It has been well loved. The backing is made up of a muslin, 4 different panels. It's not foundation pieced as some log cabin quilts are. It's entirely pieced and quilted by hand, but I think the backing pieces were machine sewn. And there's one area along the right-hand side where the strip has been pieced. You could see quite clearly there's machine sewing there. The fabric of the backing is nothing special. It has a lot of weaving mistakes in it, that kind of thing. So it really was utilitarian backing fabric. Other physical characteristics include the quilting pattern, which follows the line of the strips. Each of the center blocks is a 3-inch square of this printed fabric, which is striped, and they're all set at a diagonal. It is bound with a narrow applied binding, applied by hand, and it's a very tiny little floral pattern. Now, I did a little bit of fiber identification, and I wasn't particularly neat when I pulled out some little bits and pieces to put onto the microscope slide to stick it under the microscope. So what I've got there, I think, is probably a sewing or a quilting thread, as well as some of the fibers from the batting. So we do have some wonderful cotton fiber spirals, spiral around just as we would assume a cotton batting to do. But there are some fibers which seem to come from that thick thread that you see that look to be as if they were mercerized. They're flat. They don't spiral very much, and they have very fat edges to them. And this will help us to identify the time period for the quilt and push it later on into the 19th century. This process of mercerization, although it was developed in the middle of the 19th century, really was not used until more towards the end of the 19th century. And you find it being used in cotton threads because the process improves the tensile strength of the thread. And I always like to do sort of a little bit of microscopic research, kind of fun. Evaluating the quilt by looking at contemporary quilts from the time and the place, I did go to the Quilt Index, and I looked to see how many quilts they had from New York that were log cabin quilts. Well, there are 231 quilts that are in the Quilt Index that are from New York and have a log cabin pattern. Some of you might know, some of you may not know, that log cabin quilts come in a wide variety of sort of sub patterns. So you've got your block, but you can take the lights and the darks and you can turn them to different angles, and you can have many variations. The one that I'm looking at is a barn raising pattern. So you have lights and darks in a diamond around the quilt. You can have windmill variation. There's courthouse steps, which is kind of a fun one. There's lightning streaks, all different kinds of variations to the theme. Pineapple as well. The log cabin quilt pattern, however, is made of having a center piece, often red, and then working around the piece, you add strips going around of lights and darks until you create your single block. Traditionally, the center is red, and sort of stories say that, oh, it's the chimney of the house around which the lights and darks might be the good and bad elements of life. I don't know, it's a nice sort of little story. There are other theories, however, and I did spend a little time looking at some of the more interesting theories as to where the log cabin pattern may have originated. One of the more horrific ideas, horrific for so many reasons, is that the tombs of Egypt with their mummies, both people as well as cats, may have been a design influence for the sort of strips around a central block that we see in our log cabin quilts. I'm not so sure, but it could have been one of the influences that one may see. Somebody might have looked at it and said, oh, isn't that an interesting pattern? How can I do that on a flat piece of fabric? Other theories suggest that some of the land cultivation techniques in England and Europe, perhaps the way the land was laid out or tilled, might have influenced a pattern that looks like a log cabin pattern. Also, perhaps the way people put tiles or other materials onto a roof may have been an influence for a log cabin pattern. In the United States, maybe our presidential campaigns helped to influence the rise of popularity of these quilts. Who knows? I do, however, respect Barbara Brackman when she says that the log cabin quilts first popped into print during the Civil War, the design of a square framed by rectangular logs, becoming a late 19th century fad, so popular that county fairs created categories just for log cabins. So certainly this log cabin quilt that we're looking at today will be set in the second half of the 19th century. And I think because of the mercerization process, we're going to push it a little bit towards the last decades of the 19th century. But it's certainly not an unusual pattern, nothing new here, very popular. Sits right into being a quilt that one would expect to see from upstate New York and in the 19th century. Now, in looking at textiles themselves, they can help to date the quilt. Closer look at these textiles really can help to maybe narrow down the time period because there are so many printed cottons on this quilt, so many of them. And they come in a wide variety. There are geometrics, there are stripes, there are polka dots, there are circles, many, many different floral patterns as well. There are larger patterns and smaller patterns. Many different patterns. They just keep going on and on and on. And then there are also fabrics that have numbers printed on them. Now, what is this suggesting to us? This is why it's important to take a second look at a quilt and not dismiss it because of its age or because of its condition. I mean, you can see clearly here, this quilt kind of has a lot of surface dirt on it, but it tells a very intriguing story. What do these strips suggest? Well, they suggest that somebody had access to perhaps the ends of bolts or the beginning of a bolt, or perhaps somebody had access to fabrics from a printing mill. Once I started looking at the fabrics, and I was glad that I could do this when Peter was there, we got a little excited about this quilt, is that different colorways started popping up all over the place on this quilt. Different colorways means that it's the same printed pattern, but done in different colors. And you can see clearly, particularly in the lower right-hand side, we have the same pattern, but one is red, one is dark blue. Above it, one blue, one is light blue, one is dark blue. And then we have to the left, we have two of the same printed designs, but in different colors. Sort of one is a burgundy-ish color and the other one is a dark blue. Well, once you start to see them, you see them everywhere. And once you start to see them, you see them everywhere. But it gets even better. Looking around, I saw a fabric with just stems and what looked like some petals on it. And then you can see there's a fabric that looks like it just has petals on it and then little dots. And then suddenly you see the fabric that occurs when you put those two pieces together. So we have examples of the cylinder that printed the red part of the design separate. So perhaps somebody was running it through just to make sure it was working properly. Then we have the cylinder that was printing the dark blue part of the design, maybe running it through, making sure everything was working correctly. And then we have the final product on the right, the red and the blue together, that creates the red and blue flower on the white fabric. This is where this particular quilt became very interesting to me. And just so that you understand how small it is, you can see here our red and blue flowers and the inches out. So these are rather small, these figures that you see printed here. The printing cylinders really began in the latter part of the 18th century. So somebody took the copper plates, which were flat, that had to be printed, stamped, if you will, in order to decorate fabric, and decided that it would be better if they were cylinders. Cylinders can roll over the fabric, or they can spin and the fabric is passed through the machine. And so by the latter part of the 18th century, the improvements to these machines were such that it was possible to print 6 colors at one time. So the fabric is running through a machine that is printing, that has 6 cylinders to it, and it's printing 6 different colors all at once. Imagine, economically speaking, how wonderful that is. How much faster you can print your textiles and get them out to the market. And once you start seeing these fabrics, you can see them everywhere. In the upper left-hand corner, we've got our red sort of little fabrics here. If you go across to the right-hand side, upper area, you've got the red and the blue. If you look down to the lower right, well, suddenly that design is red and blue and combined. And if you look across the way to the lower left, we've got our light and dark blue stems with the petals being printed onto a striped background. But if you look very closely across the way to the lower right hand side, you can see that same pattern, but it's being printed onto something with circles. So the different colorways are just everywhere on this particular quilt. And I think that really is the beauty of this quilt. The presence of these incomplete prints and the different colorways and such sort of reinforces the idea that the person who made this quilt, or someone within the maker's social circle, worked in a printing mill and had access to these different seconds, runoffs, whatever we want to call them, scraps, that kind of thing. Now, more research can be done to see if they were cotton printing mills in the Albany, New York area. And I don't really know. That is another avenue down which I can travel in order to get more information about this particular quilt. Once you start seeing the different colorways, they are everywhere. And the 3 different colorways that you see here show a very Oriental influence. Oriental influence, you can see it after particularly the Centennial Exposition of 1876. People began to be very interested because they could see the designs from China and Japan that were in the different exhibits in Philadelphia in that year. You'll also see that wonderful burgundy color. It's above to the right, very popular in the last decades of the 19th century. And if you look closely across the top of the left-hand block, you can see that light blue color, again, very popular in 1880, 1890, and in the early 20th century. Geometrics, circles everywhere, spots everywhere. again, very popular, particularly in the latter part of the 19th century. I mean, we really, I think, can place this quilt in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, or perhaps in the first decade of the 20th century. And there's one little interesting thing to note. Up at the top, that dark blue fabric, which has white polka dots on it, if you look closely, you can see that all of those white polka dots really don't have any fabric in them. And it's an example of discharge dyeing. So the fabric has been dyed blue, dark blue, probably with indigo dye. And then somebody has come along and the discharge dye is placed onto the dark blue fabric to take the dye away. So the polka dots were dyed afterwards with something to bleach the blue out. And it has deteriorated the cotton quite nicely so that all of those little probably white dots are no longer there. I mean, I can just go on and on now about this quilt. There's so much to see. There's nothing unusual about it at the time, and it was certainly made for utilitarian reasons. It's been well used. It shows creativity in the use of the log cabin design, as well as the barn raising pattern and such. I think it's interesting that the person who made this quilt seems to have had access to a sewing machine, because the backing was pieced by machine, but all the other work was done by hand. Piecing of the different strips as well as the quilting was done by hand. I think that's said something about the maker of the quilt. And what else does it say to us today? It shows us certainly quite a bit about printing techniques in the latter part of the 19th century, how these small florals were put together. It shows us that somebody thought that these fabrics were all very valuable. They put them into a quilt that they spent quite a bit of time working on, and they didn't mind the fact that they had some that were just the stems of the floral pattern, or the petals of the floral pattern, or actually had the numbers on them from the end of the bolt, or whatever those numbers signify. This person used all of those fabrics in order to make this quilt. And I think it shows that the maker treated those fabrics with care, that they were of value to that person. What does it mean to me today? Well, I am still thinking of what I'm going to do with it. So I think I'm going to fold it back up again and put it away for another time. But certainly this quilt, regardless of its condition, regardless of the fact that there's nothing special about it, has quite a story to tell for all of us. The Quilt Index organizes much of the descriptive data that you can use for your own material culture study. And I would certainly suggest that you go and look at what they have to offer. And the American Quilt Study Group is the organization to which I belong. If you want to learn more about quilts, become a part of a group that is thinking about quilts past, present, and future, please think about going online, looking up our organization, and joining. And then there is a little bit of a bibliography if you want to learn more about quilts, quilt history, textile history. Thank you very much.